Who was the smartest president? It's a pretty common question. It's the kind of thing that you might ask of the leaders of a great nation like the United States. So let's consider. Well, it might have been Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was the most accomplished person of his day intellectually. He was a philosopher, he was a scientist, he was an excellent writer. He knew a lot of stuff, and he had, the intellectual firepower to back it up. So Jefferson's a possibility. If you look at other presidents of the 19th century, they don't really stand out in that regard, and we'll kind of circle back to why this might be so. But you really have to get down to maybe James Garfield, elected in 1880. He was a classically educated scholar, individual. He could read Latin and Greek. He also happened to be ambidextrous. It was said, I don't know if it was true or not, but it was said that he could write Latin with his left hand and Greek with his right hand simultaneously. So, is he the smartest? Well, we'll hold that thought, that possibility. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was, before Theodore Roosevelt became president, he was a published historian. He wrote lots of stuff. In fact, in the course of his life, which wasn't even that long, he didn't even, just about 60 years old when he died, he published something like 40 books, 40 or 45, depending on how you count them. And he did this always as a writer on the side. He always had a day job, a full-time job. So Roosevelt knew a lot. He was famous for bringing top scholars, top scientists, top writers to the White House and to quiz them on what they were doing, although it was sometimes said that he would invite these stellar intellects to the White House and then proceed to lecture to them the whole time rather than listening. If you get past Theodore Roosevelt, his rival in politics, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a college professor. He had a PhD. Now, I don't know if that makes you smart, but it suggests you're a pretty good student. But he was actually an excellent professor. He was a historian and a political scientist. He became president of Princeton University before going into politics, but that is sort of real-life politics as opposed to academic politics. He was governor of New Jersey and then president of the United States. So he was a heavy hitter intellectual. He was, in fact, what in those days, maybe actually what in these days too, is called a public intellectual. He was an academic, but he often spoke on things outside the academic realm. So Woodrow Wilson's a possibility there. If we go further ahead, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is perhaps an unlikely candidate for this, but people who knew Lyndon Johnson, in fact, even including people who were around really smart people, they often said that for sheer intellectual firepower, nobody topped Johnson, in the sense that Johnson could cut to the heart of a debate. Johnson could look through a memo, just flip through a memo and get the key points. He could listen to somebody. He could be briefed verbally, and he would just go right to the heart of the issue. So Johnson was this guy who was kind of an overpowering intellect. His degree was from what was then called Southwest Texas Teachers College, now Texas State. So he wasn't an intellectual, but he certainly was smart. Bill Clinton, maybe. Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. This is a fancy scholarship. It's a very competitive scholarship that you apply for as an undergraduate, and you get to do graduate work at Oxford University. It's named for Cecil Rhodes, the old British imperialist. But these are scholarships that are internationally competitive. And for somebody to get one, actually some kid from small town Arkansas, to get one of these is quite a feather in his cap. And people who know Bill Clinton, they've often commented he's a really bright guy. And in fact, if you listen to him just give press conferences during his presidency, and just the way he could speak extemporaneously. He was a guy who clearly had a lot going on upstairs. So those are Barack Obama. Barack Obama's a smart individual, and he impressed a lot of people as well. So it would be actually quite foolish to try to rank in any kind of authoritative way presidents from smartest down the list, because we have no access to IQ tests or anything like that. IQ tests weren't even invented until the 20th century. So what do you do with presidents of the 18th and 19th centuries? But even there, IQ measures a certain slice of intelligence, but it doesn't really capture the broad the broad mental capabilities to do important and useful work. Which raises maybe another point, and maybe it was the question that should have been asked before I even addressed the question of who is the smartest president, and that is, well, does it matter? Because if you look at the most important presidents, what most people call the greatest presidents, you can take Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, and if you have a soft spot in your heart for George Washington, include him there. And no one would ever say that any one of those three was, the smartest guy in the room if the room was, very large at all. So it really kind of underlines something that's important, not simply about the presidency, but in fact about a lot of jobs, occupations, professions. So it's at least been my observation, and I think other people would agree with this, that for most jobs there's a minimum level of intelligence. If we're talking about intelligence, smarts. And you have to be smart enough. But once you get beyond smart enough, there are other characteristics that come into play. So it was said of Franklin Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt, yeah, he went to Harvard and all that, but people in those days got to Harvard because of who their father was and how much money they'd given to the university and all that sort of thing. It really wasn't anywhere near as selective as it is today. But people said of Franklin Roosevelt, well, in fact, it was said of Roosevelt by Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice, that he had a second-class mind, but a first-class temperament. Second-class mind, but first-class temperament. And this is probably more important than having the smartest brain. Because temperament is all important in success in the presidency. George Washington had just the right temperament to be America's first president, especially in the 1790s, when Americans still retained that kind of culture of deference. They were willing to look up to someone who could portray himself, could imagine himself to be one of the elites. Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln had just the temperament of sympathy, of courage, of determination to lead the country through the Civil War. One of the things that Lincoln's experience demonstrates, and Franklin Roosevelt's too, and I'm just about to get to, is that when you're president of the United States, you don't have to be the smartest person around because you can hire the smartest people around. And they can do the heavy lifting. They can apply the brain power and they can come up with recommendations. Oh, and what you need besides the temperament. So Roosevelt, second-class mind, first-class temperament. Besides the temperament, the most important thing that a president needs is good judgment. Because, as I say, you can hire the smartest people around to say, okay, Mr. President, these are your alternatives. But you, the president, you have to make the choice. And in fact, you can get really smart people arguing one side of the issue, arguing the other side of the issue. And you're the one who has to decide between the two. And how do you do this? Judgment is more, or maybe it's less than, maybe it's different from just being smart. Because we probably all know smart people who didn't have very good judgment, who didn't make good decisions. Because the key thing about being president is, do you make good decisions? At least I should say that's half of the job. The other half is being able to connect with the American people, and that's where temperament comes in. And this is where Franklin Roosevelt really excelled. Because Roosevelt inherited the presidency at the time the country was in its deepest economic distress ever. And he put in place a series of reforms, the New Deal. But more important than the reforms, because the New Deal by itself did not pull the United States out of the Depression. There was improvement in the first 3 or 4 years of the New Deal. But then things slipped back in 1937, and by the end of 1937, the country was hardly better off than it was when Roosevelt was inaugurated the first time in 1933. But what Roosevelt did was to let the American people know that Somebody in Washington cared for them. It was part simply of his approach. It was also due to his use of radio, his conducting of the fireside chat. So he made Americans feel that he was working for them. He gave Americans hope. He gave Americans confidence. Roosevelt famously said in his first inaugural address that Americans had nothing to fear but fear itself. And this was partly true and partly not. There were actually lots of things wrong with the economy that Americans might very well have feared. But he also understood that if he could reinstill confidence in the American people, then he'd be halfway toward leading the country out of the Depression. And so the thing that people remembered about Franklin Roosevelt, in fact, people of a certain age all could tell you, and many are still alive, not many, some are still alive, can tell you where they were when they got the news that Franklin Roosevelt had died. He died suddenly in April 1945. And he had been president for a little over 12 years. And if you were of a certain age, if you were maybe 20 years old or something like that, the age of college students, you probably you didn't remember any presidents before Franklin Roosevelt. And so he had become this sort of father figure. And being able to fill this role was especially important for Americans during the Great Depression and World War II, when the president had to be sort of cheerleader-in-chief for the economy, as well as commiserator-in-chief for those people who were in distress. And then he had to be, commander-in-chief during the war and consoler-in-chief to those who had lost loved ones in the fighting. So what Franklin Roosevelt's experience, or what his performance demonstrates, is that, you have to be smart enough. You have to at least have that second-class mind. You don't have to be a Nobel Prize winner. You don't have to have that kind of intellect. What you do need is a Nobel Prize-winning temperament to be really successful. So there we are. You got to be smart enough to be president, but once you're smart enough, then other characteristics, other traits, other gifts become more important.